Her husband cast her out as barren, but a mountain man made her a mother in 5 days. Thrown into the cold by the man who once preached salvation, a broken woman stumbles into the storm and into the arms of a stranger living high in the mountains. He's a man who's buried his past, a man who swore never to love again. But when he finds her half frozen at his door, something stirs. A mercy he thought long dead. As the fire crackles, secrets unfold. The child she lost may still live. The preacher who damned her carries a sin of his own. And the mountain man's vow to protect her will test every law between heaven and earth. In a land where faith can be twisted and hearts can thaw, can compassion build a family where blood could not? Or will the past come riding up the mountain to destroy the only love they've ever known? 5 days, 1 storm, a woman cast out, and a mountain man who dares to call her mother. Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Thunder cracked overhead as Margot Cullen stood before her husband's congregation, her hands trembling as she clutched her worn leather Bible. The late autumn rain hammered against the church's timber roof, but the sound couldn't drown out Preacher Nathaniel Cullen's booming voice as it filled every corner of the small frontier church. "Behold," he declared, pointing an accusing finger at his wife, "the curse of barrenness stands before you." His dark eyes blazed with righteous fury, spittle flying from his lips as he condemned her. 4 years of marriage, and not 1 child has she given me. The Lord's judgment is clear." Margot's cheeks burned as she felt the weight of every stare in the rough-hewn pews. Women she'd thought were friends looked away, pressing closer to their own children. Men shifted uncomfortably, their Sunday boots scraping against the plank floor. Not 1 voice rose in her defense. "Please," she whispered, though her voice could barely be heard above the storm. "Nathaniel, I've prayed every day." "Silence!" The preacher's hand slashed through the air. "Your prayers are hollow, woman. Your faithlessness has poisoned our marriage bed." He turned to address the congregation, his black coat cutting a severe line against the gray light filtering through the windows. "Did not the good book tell us that children are a heritage from the Lord, that the fruit of the womb is his reward?" Margot's vision blurred with tears as she watched the faces of people she'd served alongside for 4 years. She'd taught their children Bible verses, nursed their sick, helped birth their babies. Yet now they sat in stone-faced judgment, accepting her husband's cruel proclamation. The preacher's voice rose to match the howling wind outside. "As your shepherd, I cannot allow this curse to remain in our midst. The Lord demands purity in his house." He fixed his cold gaze on Margot. "You are no longer welcome in my home or my church. Get out!" For a moment, Margot couldn't move. The words struck her like physical blows, driving the breath from her lungs. "Nathaniel, please, where would I go?" "That is no longer my concern." He turned his back on her, a clear dismissal. "The Lord will provide for you according to your merit." Margot's legs trembled as she took 1 stumbling step toward the door, then another. She had no coat. They'd rushed to church when the first drops fell. Her thin dress and shawl offered little protection against the weather. The Bible in her hands was all she had left of her mother. The congregation's silence felt like a physical weight as she walked down the center aisle. No one reached out to stop her. No one offered shelter. These people who had broken bread at her table, whose children she had comforted, whose sick she had tended, they all watched her go with averted eyes. At the church door, she paused. The rain slanted down in steel-gray sheets, and the wind cut like a knife. Her shoes, simple cloth things meant for indoor wear, would be soaked through in moments. With shaking fingers, she removed them, tucking them into a pocket of her dress. Better to go barefoot than risk ruining her only footwear. The first step onto the muddy ground sent a shock of cold through her body. The second step was no easier, but Margot forced herself forward. Pride kept her spine straight as she walked away from the only home she'd known since her marriage. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her run. The wagon road stretched before her, a rutted ribbon of mud winding toward the distant mountains. Margot had no destination in mind, no family to turn to, no friends who would dare defy the preacher's judgment. Each step was a prayer. For death or mercy, she wasn't sure which. The rain soaked through her clothes within minutes, plastering her dress to her skin and turning her shawl into a sodden weight around her shoulders. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around her face. Still, she clutched her Bible close, trying to protect it from the worst of the weather. The familiar leather binding was smooth under her fingers, worn from years of daily reading. As she walked, memories of her marriage played through her mind like scenes from a bitter play. The early days of hope, when she'd believed Nathaniel's passion for preaching meant a passion for God's love. The gradual cooling of his affection as month after month passed without signs of pregnancy. The way his sermons grew harder, more focused on judgment than mercy. The nights she spent on her knees, begging God to give her a child, to make her worthy of her husband's love. The rain began to ease as afternoon faded toward evening, but the wind grew sharper. Margot's feet were numb, caked with mud, and scratched from stones along the road. Her dress hem was thick with dirt, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Still, she pushed onward, though she had no idea where the road might lead. As darkness gathered under the heavy clouds, the first snowflakes began to fall. They melted as they touched her skin, adding their chill to her already frozen body. The mountains ahead were lost in gray mist, and the trees along the road became looming shadows. Margot's steps grew more uncertain. Her thoughts moved like molasses, thick and slow. The cold had settled deep in her bones, and even the pain in her feet had faded to a distant ache. The Bible slipped from her nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud in the mud. When she bent to retrieve it, her legs gave way. She found herself on her knees beside a massive pine stump, its flat surface silvered with age. The snow was falling faster now, dusting her hair and shoulders with white. "Lord," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I don't understand. I tried so hard to be good, to be worthy." Her fingers traced the grain of the old stump as tears froze on her cheeks. "If this is your judgment, then let it be quick." The wind keened through the trees like a mourning woman, and snowflakes danced in the gathering dark. Margot's body felt impossibly heavy as she slumped against the stump. Her last conscious thought was a prayer, not for herself, but for those she was leaving behind. "Forgive them, Father, and forgive me, if you can." The snow continued to fall, gradually covering her still form with a white blanket as night descended on the frontier road. Her Bible lay nearby, its pages fluttering in the wind, open to a passage about mercy and grace that no one was left to read. The pale winter dawn crept over the Gunnison Highlands, painting the snow-covered pines in shades of rose and gold. Jameson Boone emerged from his cabin, his breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. A fresh blanket of snow covered his familiar world, transforming the rough clearing into something pristine and new. He adjusted the rifle slung across his back and checked the hunting knife at his belt, habits ingrained by years of frontier life. The morning's tasks stretched before him. Check the snare line, split more firewood, Perhaps set new traps if the weather held. Simple work for a simple life, just as he preferred it. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the woodpile. Something caught his eye, an unusual shadow against the white. Jameson's hand moved instinctively to his rifle as he approached, but then he stopped short. It wasn't an animal seeking shelter. It was a woman. She lay crumpled against his woodpile, half buried in snow. Her dark hair was frozen in tangles, and her thin dress was little more than ice-stiff rags. A small book lay nearby, its leather binding warped from moisture. "Dear Lord," Jameson muttered, dropping to one knee beside her. He pressed rough fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse. There, faint but steady. Her skin was ice cold, but she still breathed, shallow puffs visible in the morning air. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird fallen from its nest. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her towards the cabin, leaving the book forgotten in the snow. Inside, the cabin was dim and cool, the fire having burned low overnight. Jameson laid the woman gently on his bed, a simple rope-strung frame near the hearth. He worked quickly, stoking the fire with fresh logs until flames leaped high. "Got to get you warm," he murmured, though she couldn't hear. He pulled his prized buffalo hide from its shelf, a reminder of better days when he'd traded with the Ute. The fur was thick and soft, still carrying the smoke scent of his wife's last blessing ceremony. As he wrapped the woman in the hide, her face caught the firelight. Despite the blue tinge to her lips and the frost on her lashes, there was something familiar about her features. He'd seen her before, though he couldn't place where. Jameson filled a pot with snow and set it to melt on the fire, then added dried meat and herbs for broth. As he worked, he kept glancing at his unexpected guest. Her breathing seemed stronger now, though she shivered violently under the hide. The morning light grew stronger, filtering through the cabin's single window. Jameson suddenly remembered the book he'd left outside. He retrieved it quickly, brushing off snow and setting it to dry near the fire. The gilt letters on its spine caught his eye. Holy Bible. Memory struck him like a physical blow. He'd seen this woman in town last spring, standing beside a tall man in a preacher's coat. Cullen, that was the name. The same preacher who'd refused to speak words over his Sarah's grave, claiming it wasn't proper to bury a heathen in Christian ground. Jameson's hands clenched into fists. 5 years had passed, but the pain of that day still burned. He'd buried Sarah himself, with only her people to witness, speaking the Ute prayers she'd taught him beneath the watching mountains. A soft moan from the bed drew his attention. The woman, Cullen's wife, was stirring, her eyes moving beneath closed lids. Fever-bright spots of color had appeared on her cheeks. "No," she murmured, tossing her head. "Please, I tried." Jameson hesitated, torn between old bitterness and present need. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his memory. The circle breaks when we choose hatred over healing. He sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "Reckon you're right, my love, as usual." Moving to the bed, he laid a calloused hand on the woman's forehead. The skin there burned with fever now, a dangerous swing from the death cold of before. She flinched at his touch, eyes flying open in terror. "Easy now," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You're safe here." Her eyes were glassy with fever, darting around the unfamiliar cabin. "Where?" "My cabin, up in the Highlands." He reached for the pot of broth. "Can you sit up? You need something warm inside you." She tried to push, herself upright, but her arms trembled too badly. Without comment, Jameson slipped an arm behind her shoulders, supporting her weight as he held a tin cup to her lips. "Small sips," he instructed. "That's it." She managed a few swallows before turning her face away. "Who?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Name's Jameson Boone. Found you half frozen by my woodpile this morning." He eased her back down as her eyes started to close. "Rest now. Questions can wait." She murmured something that might have been "thank you" before slipping back into unconsciousness. Jameson watched her for a moment, noting how young she looked in sleep. Whatever had driven her out into last night's storm must have been dire indeed. The day passed slowly. Jameson tended the fire, made more broth, and occasionally checked on his patient. She drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes crying out in fever dreams. He caught fragments of what seemed to be prayers, pleas for forgiveness, and once a broken whisper. "Not Barren. Please, not cursed." As evening approached, he finally ventured out to check his nearest snare line. The rabbit he found would make decent stew if she lived long enough to eat solid food. The thought surprised him. He was already planning for her recovery, despite not knowing her story. When he returned, she was shivering again, though the cabin was warm. He added another log to the fire and felt her forehead. The fever still raged, and her breathing had grown labored. Jameson sat heavily in his chair, studying her face in the firelight. She bore little resemblance to her husband. Where the preacher was all hard angles and cold judgment, she seemed made of softer stuff. Even in illness, there was a gentleness about her features that reminded him painfully of Sarah. "Lord," he said quietly, his rough voice barely disturbing the cabin's silence. "I reckon you know why she's here. Can't say I understand your ways, bringing Cullen's wife to my door." He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "But Sarah would say that's not for me to judge, so if you're listening, maybe see fit to let her live. Seems she's suffered enough." The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, a lone coyote called to the rising moon, its song ancient and mournful. Jameson settled deeper into his chair, preparing for a long night's vigil. "Rest easy, Mrs. Cullen," he murmured. "Whatever brought you here, you're safe now." The woman slept on, her fate still uncertain. But in choosing mercy over vengeance, Jameson had already changed both their paths in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As night settled over the highlands, the cabin stood like a beacon of warmth against the darkness, sheltering two wounded souls brought together by providence or chance, or perhaps something greater than either. Margot woke to unfamiliar shadows dancing on rough-hewn logs. Her mind felt clouded, as if she were swimming up through deep water. The first, clear sensation was warmth. Blessed, bone-deep warmth wrapped around her like an embrace. She lay beneath something heavy and soft, its musky scent both strange and comforting. Turning her head took enormous effort. A stone fireplace dominated the nearby wall, flames crackling behind an iron grate. Her vision swam as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. This wasn't her bedroom above the church. This wasn't anywhere she knew. Memory crashed over her like ice water. The congregation's stern faces, her husband's thundering condemnation, the endless walking through rain and snow. She had expected to die in that storm. Perhaps she had, and this was some strange afterlife. A floorboard creaked, and Margot flinched, shrinking deeper into the covers. A tall figure moved into view, silhouetted against the firelight. Her heart hammered until he stepped closer, revealing weathered features that held no threat, just weary kindness and careful distance. "You're awake." His voice was rough but quiet, like he wasn't used to speaking. Had me worried for a spell there? Margot tried to respond, but her throat felt raw. The man disappeared from view, returning moments later with a tin cup. Here. Small sips, mind? The liquid was warm and savory, some kind of broth. Her hands shook too badly to hold the cup, so he supported it, his calloused fingers steady and impersonal. After a few swallows, her voice returned as a whisper. Thank you. Where? My cabin, up in the Gunnison Highlands. He set the cup aside. Found you half frozen by my woodpile yesterday morning. I'm Jameson Boone. Margot Cullen, she managed, then immediately wished she hadn't given her full name. But if he recognized it, his expression didn't change. You're safe here, Mrs. Cullen. Storm's still blowing outside, but the cabin's solid enough. As if to confirm his words, wind whistled around the corners of the building. Margot gathered her courage to look around properly. The cabin was small but orderly, everything in its place. A wooden table and chair stood near the window, both showing signs of careful craftsmanship. Shirts hung from pegs on the wall, their worn spots neatly mended. Her gaze caught on something that seemed out of place. A cradle, lovingly carved with leaf patterns, sitting untouched near the hearth. A fine layer of dust covered its smooth rails. Something about that silent cradle made her heart ache, though she couldn't say why. Can you manage more broth? Jameson's question drew her attention back. It's venison. Got lucky with the hunting last week. Margot nodded, managing to hold the cup herself this time. As she sipped, she studied her rescuer more carefully. He moved with the easy grace of someone accustomed to hard work, but there was something careful in how he kept his distance, like a wild creature unused to company. You live here alone? The question slipped out before she could stop it. A shadow crossed his face. These days, yes. Something in his tone warned against further questions. Margot focused on her broth instead, but her eyes kept straying to the cradle. There was a story there, one that explained both its loving craftsmanship and its abandoned state. Suddenly, Jameson's name clicked in her memory. Horror flooded through her as she remembered her husband's sneering words about the mountain man who'd sullied himself by marrying a Ute woman. She'd been new to town then, still learning the local gossip. But she remembered how cruel the whispers had been, how her husband had refused to. The cup slipped from her trembling fingers. Jameson caught it before it could spill, his reflexes startling quick. I'm sorry, Margot whispered, meaning far more than the near accident. I remember now, what my husband did. When your wife... Don't. His voice was sharp, then gentled with visible effort. That's past business. But he was wrong, so wrong. I wanted to say something then, but I was too much of a coward. The words tumbled out, driven by fever and shame. I've always been too much of a coward. Jameson was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if the memories were pulling him back through years. Sarah, my wife, she used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. He looked back at Margot, his eyes kind but sad. Reckon you showed some courage, walking away from what wasn't right, even if it meant facing the storm. Tears pricked at Margot's eyes. She didn't feel courageous. She felt broken and lost, a failure in every way that mattered. The weight of her shame pressed down like a physical thing, her barrenness, her weak faith, her inability to be the wife her husband demanded. As if reading some of her thoughts, Jameson spoke again, his voice gruff but gentle. Rest now. Questions and explanations can wait until you're stronger. Margot wanted to protest, to explain or apologize more, but exhaustion was already pulling her under. The last thing she saw was Jameson building up the fire, his movements sure and practiced in the growing darkness. She drifted in and out of awareness as evening settled over the cabin. Each time she opened her eyes, Jameson was there, moving quietly about his tasks, adding wood to the fire, stirring something in a pot, mending what looked like a trap line. The domestic sounds were oddly comforting, so different from the cold silence of her former home. At one point, she woke to find him spreading blankets near the hearth. "You should keep your bed," she protested weakly. "I can sleep by the fire." He shook his head. "You're still healing. Bed's yours until you're stronger." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Besides, storms like this force even wild animals to share dens. Reckon we can manage the same." The simple kindness in his words brought fresh tears to Margot's eyes. How long had it been since anyone had shown her such basic decency? She turned her face away, not wanting him to see her cry. The wind howled outside, rattling the window in its frame. Snow whispered against the walls like lost spirits seeking shelter. But inside, the fire crackled steadily, and the buffalo hide wrapped around Margot smelled of smoke and safety. Despite everything, her fears, her shame, her uncertain future, she felt oddly protected in this stranger's home. Just before sleep claimed her completely, she heard Jameson's quiet voice murmuring what might have been a prayer. Not in English, but in words that sounded ancient and right, like wind through pine branches. The strange syllables followed her down into dreams, where for once no one stood in judgment over her failures. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the cabin's walls, 2 wounded souls had found an uneasy truce. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, the simple fact of survival was enough. They were, as Jameson had said, like wild creatures sharing a den, each careful of the other's space, each grateful for the shelter, each carrying their own burdens of loss and memory. The cradle stood silent, witness by the hearth, its dusty presence a reminder of dreams that had died and others that might yet be born. But that was a story for another day, when trust had grown stronger and wounds had begun to heal. For now there was only the fire's warmth, the storm's song, and the quiet breathing of 2 people who had somehow found refuge in each other's broken places. Morning light filtered through the frost-covered window, casting pale shadows across the cabin floor. Margot woke to find herself still wrapped in the buffalo hide, her body stiff but stronger than the day before. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and Jameson was already up, moving quietly as he added kindling to rebuild the flames. Pushing herself to sit up, she winced at her aching muscles. "Please, let me help with something. I can't just lie here while you do everything." Jameson glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "You need rest." "What I need is to feel useful." Margot's voice was soft but determined. "I saw your mending pile yesterday. At least let me fix that torn shirt I spotted." For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Then his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded. "If you're sure you're up to it, but eat something first." He brought her a bowl of cornmeal mush sweetened with dried berries. While she ate, Margot watched him move around the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking his stores, arranging his tools. Everything had its place, yet the cabin held an air of emptiness, as if it were missing some vital warmth. After finishing her breakfast, Margot slowly got to her feet. Her legs trembled, but they held her weight. First, she found the broom in its corner and began to sweep, despite Jameson's protests. "The floor can wait," he said, frowning. "It helps me think," she replied, continuing. her steady strokes. And I've always found that a clean floor makes everything else feel more orderly. She didn't add that it was one of the few things her husband had praised her for, her dedication to keeping their home spotless. As she worked, dust motes danced in the sunbeams. The simple rhythm of sweeping brought color back to her cheeks. When she finished, she collected Jameson's mending pile and settled in the chair by the window, where the light was best. "You don't have to earn your keep," Jameson said gruffly, watching her thread a needle. "I know." Margot smiled faintly. "But I want to. Keeping busy. It helps keep the darker thoughts at bay." Something in her words seemed to reach him. He nodded slowly, then went back to his own tasks, though she noticed him glancing her way more than once as she worked. The morning passed in comfortable silence. Margot's fingers moved steadily, patching holes and reinforcing worn seams. Each stitch felt like a small act of gratitude, a way to thank this solitary man for his unexpected kindness. As the sun climbed higher, Jameson set water to boil for tea. The familiar domestic sounds, the crackle of the fire, the soft whisper of thread through fabric, the quiet clink of tin cups, seemed to fill some of the cabin's emptiness. "My husband," Margot began suddenly, surprising herself. "He always said my barrenness was a sign of God's displeasure." Her fingers kept moving, though her voice wavered. 5 years of marriage and no child. He said my faith must be weak, that I was being punished for some secret sin. Jameson's movements stilled. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders tense. "I prayed so hard," she continued, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. "I fasted. I read my Bible until the words blurred, but nothing changed. And with each passing month, his contempt grew stronger. Some men," Jameson said slowly, "twist faith into a weapon. That ain't what it's meant for." Margot's hands stilled in her lap. Did you have faith? Before?" He turned then, his face shadowed with old pain. "Sarah, my wife, she taught me about faith. Not the kind that judges or condemns, the kind that sees the Creator's hand in every sunrise, every new leaf." He moved to the hearth, touching the dusty cradle with gentle fingers. "We had 2 good years together. Then the fever came through. Took her and our unborn child both. I'm so sorry." The words felt inadequate against such loss. "Town wouldn't bury her in the regular cemetery," he continued, his voice rough. "Said it wasn't proper, her being Ute. Your husband, he refused to say words over her grave. So I buried her up here, where she loved to watch the sunset. Said the prayers she taught me in her own language." Margot's heart ached. She remembered that time, remembered her shame at staying silent while others whispered their cruel judgments. It was wrong, what they did, what we all did. "Was a time I wanted to hate the whole town for it," Jameson admitted. "But Sarah, she always said hatred poisoned the one carrying it more than anyone else." He smiled slightly, though his eyes remained sad. "Reckon she was right about that, like she was about most things." As evening approached, Jameson prepared a simple supper of beans and dried venison. The wind had picked up again, howling around the cabin's corners like a living thing. Margot had finished his mending and folded everything neatly, taking comfort in these small acts of order. After they ate, she reached for her small Bible, which Jameson had rescued along with her. Would you like to read together?" He hesitated, then nodded. They sat near the fire, its warmth pushing back the growing darkness. Margot opened to the Beatitudes, her fingers finding the familiar pages without thought. "Blessed are the merciful," she read softly, "for they shall obtain mercy." Beside her, Jameson's breath caught. When she glanced at him, His face was turned toward the flames, but she saw something glisten in his eyes. "Your wife was right," Margot said gently, "about hatred poisoning the one who carries it. But mercy can heal both the one who gives it and the one who receives it." "Been a long time since I heard these words," Jameson said, his voice rough. Sarah used to read them in English, and her own tongue said truth was truth no matter what language it wore. They read on together, his deep voice sometimes faltering over familiar phrases that seemed to carry new weight. Outside, the storm grew stronger, but inside, something else was growing too. A fragile trust, built on shared pain and unexpected understanding. As the evening deepened, Margot felt sleep tugging at her again. Jameson insisted she take the bed once more, despite her protests. As she drifted off, she was aware of him moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire for the night. Jameson paused in his evening tasks, his gaze drawn to Margot's hands, folded peacefully atop the blanket. They were work-worn hands, marked by years of domestic labor, yet there was a gentleness in them he hadn't expected. Today, those hands had brought something back to his cabin that had been missing since Sarah's death. Simple acts of care, the quiet grace of everyday tasks done with love. He thought about the way she'd read the Bible without judgment or condemnation, only a quiet hope that felt as real as the flame's warmth. Perhaps, he thought, God was working in ways he didn't yet understand. Sarah had always said the Creator's paths weren't straight lines but circles, bringing people together in unexpected ways. The wind moaned outside, but its lonely sound couldn't quite reach the peace that had settled over the cabin. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, there was this. Two wounded souls finding comfort in shared stories, shared silence, and the simple truth that mercy could build bridges across the deepest chasms of loss and pain. Jameson added another log to the fire, its soft crackle a counterpoint to the storm's wild song. In its light, he could see his wife's cradle, no longer quite so dusty after Margot's careful cleaning. For the first time in years, its presence didn't bring only pain. Instead, it stood as a reminder that even empty vessels could be filled again, with new hope, new purpose, new life. He settled onto his blankets near the hearth, listening to Margot's steady breathing and the wind's restless voice. Time would tell what path lay ahead. But for now, this moment of peace was enough. Here in this small cabin, beneath heaven's watchful eye, mercy was doing its quiet, healing work. The mountain air carried the first hints of spring, though patches of snow still lingered in the shadowed hollows. 3 days had passed since Margot's arrival, each one settling into a gentle rhythm of shared tasks and quiet companionship. She stood at the cabin's door, breathing in the crisp morning air while hanging freshly washed shirts to dry. Jameson worked nearby, splitting logs with steady, practiced swings. The familiar thunk of axe against wood had become a comforting sound to Margot, as regular as a heartbeat. She found herself humming softly as she worked, an old hymn her mother had taught her. The peace shattered with the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Jameson's head snapped up, his body tensing like a wolf scenting danger. He set down his axe and moved closer to the cabin, his eyes scanning the narrow valley below. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. "Best get inside." But before Margot could move, 2 riders emerged from the tree line. Her heart stumbled as she recognized them. Deacon Miller and Deacon Thompson, pillars of her husband's congregation. They rode hard, their horses' flanks dark with sweat. "Stay behind me," Jameson murmured, positioning himself between Margot and the approaching men. The deacons reined in their mounts, sending gravel scattering. Deacon Miller, a tall man with iron-gray hair, spoke first. "Mrs. Cullen, your husband sent us to fetch you home." Margot's fingers clutched at her apron, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "This is my home now." "Woman, you're living in sin," Deacon Thompson spat. "The preacher offers you a chance at repentance. Return willingly, and he'll take you back, despite your shame." "The only shame," Jameson's voice cut through the air like a blade, "is in men who drive a woman into the snow to die." Deacon Miller's face darkened. "This ain't your business, Boone. Step aside." "She's under my protection." Jameson's stance widened slightly, his shoulders square. "That makes it my business." "Protection?" Deacon Thompson sneered. "Is that what you call seducing another man's wife? Living here in sin with—" "She's my wife now." Jameson's declaration rang across the yard, startling even the horses. "Or she will be, if that's what it takes to keep her safe from men who twist God's word to suit their cruel hearts." Margot felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She stared at Jameson's broad back, his words echoing in her ears. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, pushing back the familiar cold of shame. "You can't just—" Deacon Miller spluttered. "I can and I have." Jameson's voice remained level, but steel ran through it. "I declare it before heaven, and any who care to listen. Margot Cullen is under my protection, my roof, my name if need be. Now ride back and tell your preacher that." "The law," Deacon Thompson began. "The law?" Jameson's laugh held no humor. "The same law that let you run a woman out with nothing but her Bible? The same law that wouldn't bury my first wife because of the color of her skin?" He took a step forward, and both horses shifted nervously. "You go on and fetch whatever law you want. But she stays here, safe and respected, which is more than she ever had in your town." The deacons exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by Jameson's quiet authority. Finally, Deacon Miller gathered his reins. "This isn't over, Boone. The preacher won't stand for such defiance." "The preacher," Jameson replied evenly, "would do well to remember that mountain justice runs different from town law. Now ride out before I forget my Christian charity." They wheeled their horses around, kicking up dust as they galloped away. Jameson watched until they disappeared into the trees before turning to Margot. She stood trembling, tears streaming down her face. "You shouldn't have. I can't let you risk—" "Hush now," his voice gentled. "Come inside before you catch a chill." In the cabin's familiar warmth, Margot sank onto a chair, her legs weak. "They'll bring trouble. The preacher, he won't let this stand." "Let him come." Jameson busied himself making tea, his movements deliberate and calm. "Man like that, his power only reaches as far as fear lets it, and I stopped fearing men's judgment long ago." "But to claim me as—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Jameson set a steaming cup before her. "I meant what I said. If you need the protection of my name, it's yours. No strings, no demands, just safety." Fresh tears spilled down Margot's cheeks. "Why would you do this for me?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Because Sarah taught me that worth isn't in what people say about you, but in what you do. And I've watched you these past days. Your kindness, your strength even when hurting." He met her eyes. "You deserve better than what that man and his town gave you." "But I'm barren," she whispered. "Cursed." "Stop that." His voice turned fierce. "You think God curses people with emptiness? No. Sometimes life just deals hard blows. Doesn't make you cursed or wrong." He gestured to the cabin around them. "Look at this place. 3 days ago it was just shelter. Now there's curtains in the window, flowers on the table, shirts mended with care. You brought life back here, Margot. Ain't nothing barren about that." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting his words sink in. Outside, The wind stirred the drying shirts, and somewhere a bird called. Such ordinary sounds, yet they felt like anchors in a storm. In the mountains, Jameson continued softly, we judge by actions, not words. A man who preaches love while dealing pain, his words mean nothing. But someone who shows kindness, who works with willing hands and a gentle heart, that's worth more than any sermon. Margot thought about the past 3 days, how Jameson had never pressed her to talk, had simply shared his space and bread, offering safety without demands. She thought of her husband's grand speeches about divine justice, always hiding cruelty behind chapter and verse. I don't know if I can be brave enough, she admitted. You already are. He smiled slightly. Took courage to survive that night in the snow. Took courage to trust a stranger. And it takes courage to stand up and claim your own worth. He paused, then added quietly, Sarah would have liked you. She always said the strongest hearts are the ones that keep their gentleness even after being broken. Night settled over the mountains, bringing with it a sharp wind that rattled the cabin's windows. Margot sat by the fire, her Bible open in her lap, but her eyes were fixed on the flames. Tears fell silently, but these were different from the bitter drops she'd shed in town. These felt cleansing, like spring rain washing away winter's grip. Jameson moved quietly around the cabin, checking doors and banking the fire. His presence felt solid, dependable as the mountains themselves. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. Whatever comes, you have a home here. Remember that. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. But as she finally lay down to sleep, Margot realized something had shifted inside her. The shame that had been her constant companion for so long felt lighter, less crushing. In its place, something new was taking root, a fragile sense of belonging, of worth proven not by words but by simple acts of kindness and protection. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its voice carrying across the valley where 2 worlds met, town and mountain, judgment and mercy, past and future. But here, in this small cabin beneath the stars, Margot felt truly sheltered for the first time in years, protected not just by walls and a name, but by the quiet strength of a man who measured worth in deeds rather than words. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold as Margot stepped onto the cabin's front porch. The crisp morning air filled her lungs, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. She pulled her shawl tighter, watching Jameson inspect the corral's weather-worn rails. Fence needs mending, he called out, his breath visible in the cool air. Storm loosened some posts. Margot descended the rough-hewn steps, her borrowed boots crunching in the frost. I'd like to help if you'll show me. How? He nodded, a slight smile touching his weathered face. Reckon 4 hands work better than 2? Together they gathered tools from the lean-to, a post hammer, heavy spikes, and lengths of rope. Jameson demonstrated how to test each post for stability, showing her where the winter's harsh weather had worked them loose from the frozen ground. Hold it steady now, he instructed, positioning a rail while Margot braced the post. The solid thunk of the hammer rang through the morning quiet. Working side by side, they fell into an easy rhythm, her steadying, him securing, neither needing many words. When the sun climbed higher, bringing warmth to their backs, Margot wiped her brow. I never thought I'd find satisfaction in such work. Honest labor feeds the spirit, Jameson replied, driving home another spike. Sarah used to say a day without using your hands was a day half-lived. The mention of his late wife hung in the air between them, but it wasn't heavy with sadness. Instead, it felt like acknowledgement of a cherished memory, freely shared. By mid-morning, their stomachs reminded them of breakfast. Inside the cabin, Margot stirred up a batch of flapjack batter while Jameson stoked the cook fire. The familiar domestic tasks felt different here. Not obligations to be judged, but simple acts of sustenance and care. Never did get the knack of these, Jameson admitted, watching her ladle batter onto the hot griddle. Mine always come out looking like mountain ranges. Margot laughed softly. The secret is in the wrist. She demonstrated the quick flip that kept them round. My grandmother taught me. She said cooking was just love made visible. They ate at the rough-hewn table, sharing the last of the maple syrup. Sunlight streamed through the window Margot had cleaned yesterday, catching dust motes in its beam. The curtain she'd fashioned from spare cloth stirred in the draft. After breakfast, Jameson led her to the woodpile. Time you learned about kindling, he said, selecting a small axe. Can't always count on dry wood being available. Need to know how to split it fine enough to catch. He showed her how to stand, how to grip the axe handle, how to let the weight do the work rather than forcing it. Her first attempts were awkward, but he stayed patient, adjusting her stance with gentle corrections. There now, he approved when she managed a clean split. You're getting the feel of it. Next came the lesson in gathering snow for washing. Jameson showed her the best spots where it collected cleanly, away from tree debris. Pack it tight in the buckets, he explained. It'll melt down to less than you think. Always gather more than you reckon you'll need. They carried the snow-filled buckets back to the cabin, setting them near the hearth to melt. Margot marveled at how such basic tasks took on new meaning here, each one a step toward self-reliance, toward building a life from the raw materials God and nature provided. As afternoon settled into evening, they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The cabin felt different now, transformed by shared work and quiet companionship. What had begun as mere shelter had become something more, a place where two wounded souls could heal, where judgment had no power against the simple truth of actions. I want to thank you, Margot said softly as they sat by the fire. Not just for taking me in, but for treating me with respect. No man ever... She paused, swallowing hard. In town, I was always found wanting. Too quiet, too plain, too barren. But here we measure different, Jameson finished for her. You don't need to be loud to be heard. Don't need to be flashy to have worth. He stoked the fire thoughtfully. Sarah taught me that. Her people knew the value of silence, of patient hands and gentle hearts. Tell me about her, Margot requested carefully, not wanting to press too hard against old grief. Jameson was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance. She was like the dawn, he finally said, quiet but full of light. Taught me to see beauty in simple things, tracks in fresh snow, hawk circles in the sky, the way shadows move across the valley. He smiled slightly. She loved this cabin, made it more than just walls and a roof, said everything has a spirit if you learn to listen right. As if summoned by his words, a sharp cry pierced the evening quiet. They looked up to see a hawk landing on the cabin's roof beam, visible through the window. Its feathers gleamed red gold in the last sunlight. Well now, Jameson said softly. Reckon Sarah's checking in on us. He met Margot's questioning look. Hawks were her people's messengers between worlds. She always said they carried prayers straight to heaven. The hawk preened its feathers, seeming in no hurry to leave. Margot watched it, feeling an unexpected peace settle over her. Here was faith without fury, belief without blame, so different from the harsh certainties she'd known before. As darkness gathered outside, she found her gaze drawn to the small cradle near the hearth. It sat silent, gathering dust, its curved wood speaking of careful craftsmanship and love. Who had slept there? What hopes had it held? She didn't dare ask, but her heart ached with wondering. Jameson noticed her looking. "Made it myself," he said quietly. "When Sarah was carrying our little one." He didn't elaborate, and Margot didn't press. Some griefs needed silence to be properly honored. The fire crackled, throwing shadows on the wall. Outside, the hawk called once more before taking wing into the gathering night. Margot added another log to the flames, watching sparks spiral up the chimney like prayers. "What do you reckon family really means?" she asked after a while. "Beyond blood and birth, I mean." Jameson considered this, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Reckon it's about choice as much as chance, about who you choose to shelter, who you choose to trust. Sarah's people knew that. They'd take in anyone willing to learn their ways, treat them like kin. Even strangers?" Margot's voice was barely above a whisper. "Especially strangers. Said that's how the circle grows stronger, by making room for those who need it." He looked at her directly. "Like you making room for beauty here, with your curtains and flowers. Like you choosing to stay and work alongside me when you could have moved on." Margot felt tears prick her eyes. "I never thought I'd find a place where I could just be, where I wouldn't have to prove my worth every day." "Worth isn't something you prove," Jameson said firmly. "It's something you are. Took me years to learn that, after losing Sarah and our little one. Thought I had to earn the right to keep breathing. But that ain't how it works." They sat in comfortable silence as night settled fully over the mountains. The cabin creaked gently, adjusting to the temperature change. Margot added more wood to the fire, her movements sure now in the familiar space. Each small task, banking coals, filling the wash bucket, setting out tomorrow's cornmeal to soak, felt like a thread being woven into a new pattern, a life she never expected but found herself cherishing. The cradle caught the firelight, its shadow dancing on the wall. Margot paused beside it, her hand hovering over its smooth wood. So much hope carved into such a small space, so much love poured into its making. She understood now why Jameson had kept it, even empty. Some things were too precious to let go, too important to forget. Night winds whispered around the cabin's corners, carrying the distant song of coyotes. Inside, the fire's warmth held back the darkness, just as shared work and quiet understanding held back the shadows of the past. Two people, brought together by fate or providence, learning that family could mean more than blood, that home could be built from something stronger than walls alone. The afternoon sun slanted through the window as Margot straightened the cabin. Her hands moved with practiced ease now, familiar with each surface and corner after days of shared living. The simple routines brought comfort, sweeping, dusting, keeping the hearth tidy. These small acts of care transformed the cabin from mere shelter into something that felt more like home with each passing day. Near the fireplace, she paused to run a gentle hand over the empty cradle. Dust had gathered in its curved hollow, a testament to seasons of disuse. As she bent to wipe it clean, something caught her eye, a small object tucked into the corner, half hidden in shadow. With careful fingers, she lifted out a wooden carving no bigger than her palm. It was a child, lovingly shaped from pine, its features smoothed by careful hands. The craftsmanship spoke of patience and hope, of long winter evenings spent dreaming of new life. The sight of it broke something loose inside her. Margot sank to her knees beside the cradle. The little carving, cradled in her trembling hands. Tears she'd held back for months spilled down her cheeks. This was how Jameson found her when he returned from checking his trap lines. He paused in the doorway, snow melting from his boots, concern etching deep lines around his eyes. "Margot?" His voice was gentle, careful not to startle her. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. "Something I've never told anyone. A sin that's been eating at my heart." Jameson set his gear aside and pulled up a chair near her. He didn't speak, just waited with the patience of a man who'd learned wisdom from mountain silences. 5 months ago, Margot began, her voice barely audible, "I found a baby, a little boy, half Indian, left near town." Her fingers traced the wooden carving as she spoke. His mother had died in childbirth. No one would take him in. They said he was better off dead than living as a half-breed. Jameson's hands tightened on his knees, but he kept silent, letting her words flow like spring thaw. "I couldn't leave him there. I just couldn't. He was so small, so perfect." Fresh tears fell. "I brought him home, made him a cradle from an old barrel. For 5 days he was mine. I named him Daniel, after the prophet who faced the lion's den. He had such beautiful eyes." Her voice broke. Jameson reached out, offering his handkerchief. The simple kindness made it harder to continue, but she forced the words out. "When Thomas, my husband, found out, he was furious. Said I'd brought shame on his house. He burned the cradle while I watched, said no child of heathens would sleep under his roof." Margot's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. "He sent the baby away. I never knew where. I begged him to tell me, but he said it was God's will that I remain childless, said my barrenness was punishment for my wickedness." "Oh, child," Jameson breathed, the words heavy with understanding. "I've prayed every night since then," Margot confessed. "Prayed that somewhere my little Daniel is safe, that someone is holding him, loving him. 5 days wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough." Jameson stood abruptly, pacing to the window. His broad shoulders were tense with emotion as he stared out at the snowy valley. When he turned back, his eyes held a fierce light. "I know where he is," he said quietly. Margot's head snapped up, hope and disbelief warring on her tear-stained face. "What?" "The baby, Daniel. He's with Taya, my wife's aunt. She's a healer among the Ute people." Jameson knelt beside her, his voice urgent. "She took in a half-blood infant 5 months ago, brought to her by a trader who said the child needed shelter. She's been caring for him ever since." "He's alive?" Margot's voice cracked. "My Daniel is alive?" "Yes." Jameson's weathered hand covered hers, steadying the wooden carving she still clutched. "Taya's camp is 3 days' ride from here, up in the high valley. The snow's deep, but if we wait for clear weather—" "Please," Margot whispered, turning her hand to grip his. "Please, I'll do anything. Just let me see him again. Let me know he's truly safe." "I'll bring him back," Jameson promised. "Soon as the weather breaks, Taya will understand. She believes every child is a gift, no matter their parentage. Sarah taught me that too." Margot closed her eyes, tears flowing freely now. "I've asked God every night to let me be a mother again, to give me another chance. I never dreamed—" "The Lord works in ways we can't fathom," Jameson said softly. "Sometimes the answer to prayer comes through the very people others reject." Standing, he moved to the cabin's small window. The setting sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. "Weather might hold for a few days. If it does, I'll ride out at first light." "I should come with you," Margot began, but Jameson shook his head. "The trail's treacherous this time of year. Better I go alone, ride fast and light. Besides," he added with gentle firmness, "you need to rest, build your strength. That little one will need his mama strong when he comes home." Home. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Margot looked around the cabin, at the curtains she'd made, the swept hearth, the cradle waiting to be filled again. Yes, this was home now. A place where love could grow, where past wounds could heal. "Will you tell me about him?" she asked softly. "How he's grown? What he looks like?" Jameson settled back in his chair, his face softening with memory. "He's thriving. Got your eyes, I reckon, though I didn't know it then. Dark hair, strong grip. Taya says he laughs at the wind in the pines." He paused, smiling slightly. She named him Morning Star in her language, but Daniel suits him too. Both names speak of light and darkness. Margot traced the edges of the wooden carving, seeing in its simple lines all the love Jameson had once poured into crafting it. "I dream of him every night. In my dreams, I'm strong enough to keep him, brave enough to stand against everyone who said he didn't deserve to live." "You were brave," Jameson said firmly. "You chose love when others chose hate. That's the kind of courage that matters most." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "Listen to me, Margot. You're not being punished. You're being led. Every step that brought you here, even the painful ones, was part of something bigger than we can see." Night was falling now, shadows gathering in the cabin's corners. Margot rose and lit the lamp, its warm glow pushing back the darkness. The familiar tasks of evening beckoned, banking the fire, setting out tomorrow's bread to rise, preparing for another day. But now each action felt different, charged with new purpose. As she worked, Margot prayed, not with the desperate pleading of past months, but with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for bringing me here. Thank you for this chance to love again. Thank you for showing me that family isn't bound by blood alone." Jameson watched her move about the cabin, his eyes thoughtful. He'd seen something change in her these past weeks, a straightening of the spine, a lifting of the spirit. The woman who'd collapsed in his woodpile, broken by judgment and shame, was becoming someone new, someone stronger. "We should check the cradle," he said after a while. "Make sure it's sound. Might need some work before we bring our boy home," Margot finished softly. "Our boy." The words felt right, felt true in a way that transcended flesh and blood. Together they examined the cradle, testing each joint and runner. Jameson pointed out where he'd need to tighten the wood, maybe add some padding for comfort. Margot listened and nodded, already planning the blankets she'd make, the clothes she'd sew. Night settled fully over the mountains, bringing with it a perfect clarity of stars. Inside the cabin, two hearts beat with renewed purpose, one planning tomorrow's journey, the other preparing for the joy of reunion. The wooden carving sat on the mantel now, catching lamplight in its smooth curves, a symbol of hope preserved through dark times. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, dangerous trails, uncertain weather, the delicate task of bridging two worlds. But tonight, in this warm circle of lamplight, Margot felt peace settle over her like a blessing. Her prayers had been heard, her path had led true. And soon, very soon, a child's laughter would fill these walls with joy. The pale winter sun had barely touched the eastern peaks when Jameson stepped out onto his cabin's porch. Frost sparkled on his beard as he drew in a deep breath of mountain air. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open, and Margot emerged, wrapped in his late wife's shawl. "The weather looks fair," she said softly, her eyes scanning the crystalline sky. "God's mercy, perhaps." Jameson nodded, adjusting the straps of his saddlebags. "Should hold through morning at least. Trail will be hard going, though. Snow's deep in the passes." He'd spent half the night preparing, checking his gear, studying the sky for weather signs, plotting the safest route to the Ute winter camp. His horse, a sturdy brown gelding, stood saddled and ready, steam rising from its nostrils in the crisp dawn air. Margot handed him a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Fresh bread, dried venison, some of that pine tea you favor." Her hands trembled slightly as she passed it over. "And a blanket, for Daniel, in case he needs it." Jameson tucked the bundle carefully into his saddlebags. The blanket was one she'd sewn from scraps during the long evenings, working by lamplight until her fingers ached. He knew what it meant. A mother's love poured into every stitch. "I'll bring him home," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Whatever it takes." Margot's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Be careful. The trail. I know these mountains better than my own hands," he assured her. "Been riding them 20 years or more." Still, as he mounted up, both knew the dangers ahead. Winter in the high country showed no mercy to the careless or unlucky. One wrong step could mean a broken leg, or worse. The horse's hooves crunched through the frozen crust of snow as Jameson guided him down the slope from the cabin. He turned once, raising his hand in farewell. Margot stood straight and tall on the porch, her figure growing smaller as distance stretched between them. The sight stirred something in his chest, an ache he thought he'd buried with Sarah 5 years ago. The first mile went easily enough, following the valley floor where the wind had swept the snow into manageable drifts. But as they began to climb, the drifts deepened. Soon Jameson had to dismount, leading his horse by the reins as they picked their way through treacherous ground. "Easy now," he murmured, testing each step. "Slow and steady wins the race." The sun climbed higher, but provided little warmth. Their progress was maddeningly slow. What should have been a 3-hour ride stretched into 5, then 6. Twice they had to backtrack when deep snow made the trail impassable. Jameson's boots were soaked through, his legs aching from breaking trail. Near midday, they crested a ridge, and he paused to catch his breath. Below lay the sheltered valley where the Ute people made their winter camp. Smoke rose from several lodges, thin gray threads against the white landscape. Somewhere down there, a fever-struck child waited, a child who belonged to both worlds, just as his own son might have, had he lived. The descent proved even more treacherous than the climb. Jameson had to guide his horse with extreme care, the animal's hooves slipping on hidden ice beneath the snow. One bad fall here could end everything. It was late afternoon when they finally approached the camp's outskirts. 2 young Ute hunters appeared on snowshoes, rifles ready but not raised. Jameson raised his empty hands, speaking a greeting in their language. "I seek Taya," he said, his accent careful but clear. "I am Jameson Boone, who was husband to Sarah Walkingstar." The hunters exchanged glances, then nodded. One led the way, while the other followed behind, cautious but not hostile. As they entered the camp proper, curious faces appeared at lodge entrances. Children whispered and pointed at the big white man leading his tired horse. Then Taya emerged from her lodge, her silver hair bound in long braids, her face creased with surprise. "Nephew?" she said in English, using the kinship term that had survived his wife's death. "Why do you travel in such weather?" "The child," Jameson said without preamble. "The half-blood baby you took in 5 months ago. I've come for news of him." Taya's expression grew grave. "Come inside," she said, holding back the lodge flap. "There is much to speak of." The lodge's interior was warm and dim, scented with sage and pine smoke. In a cradleboard near the fire lay an infant, his small face flushed with fever. Jameson's heart clenched. The boy had Sarah's coloring, but those were Margot's eyes, even glazed with sickness. "The fever came 3 days ago," Taya explained, kneeling beside the cradle. "I have tried the old remedies, but still it burns in him." She touched the baby's forehead with gentle fingers. He fights hard, this little one, like both his peoples. Jameson moved closer, studying the child's face. His mother lives, he said quietly. She's at my cabin now, the preacher's wife who first took him in. Taya's eyes sharpened with interest. The kind one? Who named him Daniel? Yes, she was cast out for sheltering him, nearly died in the snow before I found her. He met Taya's knowing gaze. I mean to bring him home to her, if you'll allow it. The old woman was silent for a long moment, watching the baby's labored breathing. It is good, she said finally. A child needs his mother's heart, whether that heart beats under white skin or red. She straightened, decision made. But he cannot travel now, not until the fever breaks. Jameson nodded, though his own heart ached at the thought of returning to Margot empty-handed. I'll bring medicine from town, and blankets, better food. Go now, before the weather turns, Taya interrupted. I feel snow in my bones. The child is safe here until you return. Outside, the sky had indeed begun to darken ominously. Jameson knew he faced a dangerous ride home, but the need to return with news drove him forward. He mounted up, accepting a small bundle of herbs from Taya for the journey. Tell his mother we keep him in our prayers, she said. Both our people's prayers. The ride back was a nightmare of gathering darkness and stinging sleet. Jameson's horse stumbled more than once, exhausted from the day's efforts. He lost the trail twice, having to backtrack until he found familiar landmarks. The temperature dropped steadily, until his hands could barely grip the reins through their numbness. But always, the thought of Margot waiting drove him onward. She would be keeping the fire burning, he knew. Preparing that broth, holding on to hope. He couldn't fail her, couldn't fail any of them. It was the darkest hour before dawn when he finally saw the cabin's lamplight gleaming through the trees. His horse's head drooped with fatigue as they made that final approach. The door flew open before he could dismount, spilling warm light into the yard. Jameson! Margot rushed out, heedless of the cold. Thank God you're safe. But where? Her voice trailed off as she saw he was alone. He's alive, Jameson said quickly, sliding from the saddle on legs that barely held him. But sick with fever. Taya's caring for him, doing all she can. Margot's face paled, but she squared her shoulders bravely. Then we'll pray harder and prepare everything he needs. She took Jameson's arm, supporting him as he swayed with exhaustion. Come, inside now. You're half frozen. The cabin's warmth hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled to his chair by the fire, where Margot helped him remove his ice-crusted coat and boots. Her hands were gentle but efficient as she wrapped him in a warm blanket. Drink this, she ordered, pressing a cup of hot coffee into his hands. Then tell me everything, every detail about my boy. So Jameson told her, thawing slowly by the fire, about Daniel's fever, but also his strength, how his eyes were just like hers, how Taya called him a fighter, how the prayers of two peoples watched over his sleep. We'll ride back as soon as weather allows, he finished. Bring medicines, whatever he needs. Margot nodded, her face set with determination. Yes, together this time. He needs both of us now. Outside, the sleet had turned to soft snow, blanketing the world in fresh white. But inside the cabin, hope burned as steady as the hearth fire. They had found Daniel, and somehow, together, they would bring him home. Dawn was breaking as Jameson finally gave in to exhaustion, slumping in his chair. The last thing he saw before sleep took him was Margot kneeling by the cradle, her lips moving in silent prayer as her fingers smoothed the blanket she'd made. In that moment, he knew with bone-deep certainty that this was what family meant. Not blood, but the willing of the heart to love beyond all boundaries. The knock came just before midnight. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. Margot startled from her vigil by the empty cradle, while Jameson was already moving toward the door, rifle in hand. "Who rides so late?" he called out, voice stern. "It is Taya," came the response, slightly muffled by wind. "I bring the child." Jameson threw open the door. There stood the Ute elder, snow dusting her shoulders, cradling a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Behind her, 2 young Ute men sat astride their horses, having escorted her through the dangerous night. Margot rushed forward with a cry, her hands reaching instinctively toward the bundle. Taya's weathered face held both compassion and caution as she stepped inside. "Gently," she warned. "The fever still burns hot in him." Jameson quickly barred the door against the cold, while Margot hovered anxiously as Taya carried the baby to the fire. With careful movements, the older woman unwrapped the deerskin, revealing Daniel's flushed face. His small chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. "Oh, my boy," Margot whispered, dropping to her knees beside them. Her fingers trembled as she touched his burning forehead. "My precious Daniel." Guilt and love warred in her expression as she studied his features, changed by the months of separation. He had grown, his face less round, dark hair curling damply at his temples. But those were still her baby's eyes, glazed now with fever, but the same deep brown she remembered. "I should never have let them take you," she murmured, voice breaking. "Can you forgive me, little one?" Taya laid a gentle hand on Margot's shoulder. "The past is smoke on the wind. Now is the time for healing." Jameson moved with quiet purpose, gathering his medicine box and setting a pot of water to boil. "We'll need willow bark tea," he said. "Taya, I've fresh bark stored in the root cellar." The old woman nodded approvingly. "Good. Add honey to make it go down easier, and yarrow if you have it." They worked together with the efficiency of long practice, Taya measuring out herbs while Jameson stoked the fire higher. Margot remained by the cradle, speaking soft words of comfort as Daniel fretted restlessly in his fever dreams. The cabin filled with the sharp, medicinal scent of brewing willow bark. Outside, snow fell steadily, but inside was warmth and desperate hope. When the tea was ready, Taya showed Margot how to give it to the baby, one careful dropperful at a time. "Like this," she demonstrated. "Slow and patient. He must take enough to help fight the fever." Margot nodded, her entire being focused on the task. When Daniel fussed and turned his head away, she hummed softly until he settled, then tried again. Drop by drop, she got most of the tea into him. The night stretched long before them. Taya dozed in Jameson's chair while he moved quietly around the cabin, banking the fire and laying out extra blankets. But Margot never left the cradle. Her prayers rose steady and clear in the darkness. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Hour by hour, the fever raged. Jameson kept snow melting in a bucket, bringing fresh cloths for Daniel's burning forehead. Each time the baby whimpered, Margot's heart clenched with fear and love. "Fight, little one," she whispered. "God hasn't brought us back together just to lose you now." Near dawn, Taya woke and came to check the child. Her practiced hands felt his chest, his throat, the pulse at his temples. She nodded slowly. "The medicine works. See how his breathing comes easier?" Margot hardly dared to hope, but it was true. Daniel's chest rose and fell more steadily now, his skin less flushed. When she touched his forehead, the burning heat had lessened. The first rays of sunrise began to paint the cabin walls in pale gold. Jameson pulled back the curtains, letting in the new day's light. It poured across the floor like honey, warming the rough-hewn boards. In the cradle, Daniel's eyes fluttered open. Clear now, free of fever's glaze. His gaze found Margot's face and held it. "Hello, my love," she breathed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Welcome back." The baby's lips curved in a tiny smile. He reached up one perfect hand, and Margot caught it gently in her own. Joy crashed through her like a wave, and she began to whisper psalms of thanksgiving. "I will praise thee, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will show forth all thy marvelous works." Taya touched the baby's forehead one last time, then stepped back with satisfaction. The fever is broken. Now he needs only rest and mother's love to grow strong again. Margot gathered Daniel into her arms, marveling at his solid weight, the sweet scent of his hair. He snuggled against her shoulder with a contented sigh, as if he had never been parted from her at all. Jameson stood by the window, watching them in the morning light. Something tight in his chest began to loosen, like ice melting in spring. The cabin felt different somehow, warmer, more alive. The shadows that had haunted its corners since Sarah's death seemed to retreat before the sight of Margot rocking Daniel, her face transformed by joy. The baby's quiet cooing filled the space where silence had reigned for so long. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, and the old cradle creaked gently with its renewed purpose. Even the rough walls seemed to soften, as if the cabin itself was awakening to new life. Taya gathered her shawl, preparing to leave. But first she placed her hands on Margot's bowed head in blessing. "You have a strong son," she said simply, "and he has a strong mother. The Great Spirit has blessed this union." Margot looked up, tears still shining on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for keeping him safe until I could find my way back to him." The old woman smiled. "It is the way of things. Sometimes we must lose our path before we can find our true home." She touched Daniel's dark hair once more. "I will return in 3 days to check on him. Keep giving the willow tea until then." Jameson walked Taya to her horse, where the 2 Ute men waited patiently. The morning air was crisp and clean, the world renewed by fresh snow. "You have done a good thing here," Taya told him quietly. "Sarah would be pleased." He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. They both knew she meant more than just helping with the baby's fever. Back inside, Margot had settled in the rocking chair, Daniel drowsing peacefully in her arms. Sunlight streamed through the window, turning her hair to copper and gold. She was singing softly, an old hymn that filled the cabin with its gentle notes. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Jameson moved quietly around them, stoking the fire and setting water to heat for breakfast. But his eyes kept returning to the tableau by the window. Mother and child bathed in morning light, their faces serene with belonging. The cabin had been just shelter before, a place to weather storms and hold grief's memories. But now, watching Margot press a tender kiss to Daniel's forehead, Jameson realized it had become something more. It had become a home. The morning deepened around them, full of small, precious sounds. Daniel's soft breathing, the crackle of the fire, Margot's quiet humming. Outside, snow continued to fall, but its meaning had changed. No longer a barrier of isolation, it now felt like a blanket drawing them closer, protecting this newfound peace. Jameson added another log to the fire, and the flames leaped up bright and strong, like the fever breaking, like prayers answered, like love reborn in unexpected places. The cabin held them all in its warm embrace as morning light poured through the windows and hope bloomed fresh as sunrise. Morning light streamed through the cabin windows, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor. Margot sat in the rocking chair, cradling the now healthy baby in her arms. Her heart felt so full it might burst. "He needs a proper name," she said softly, looking up at Taya and Jameson. "Something strong, something with meaning." Taya nodded, her wise eyes crinkling at the corners. "Names carry power. They shape the path a child will walk." Margot studied the infant's peaceful face. His dark eyes, so like his Ute mother's, gazed back at her with complete trust. "Daniel," she breathed. "I want to call him Daniel." "After the prophet?" Jameson asked, pausing in his work at the wooden cradle. "Yes." Margot smiled. "Daniel survived the lion's den because of his faith. He never lost hope, even in darkness." She touched the baby's cheek gently. "This little one has survived so much already. The name feels right." "Daniel," Taya repeated, tasting the word. Then she spoke something melodious in Ute, her voice rich with ceremony. "What does that mean?" Margot asked. "I gave him his Ute name as well. It means strong heart, born of two worlds." The older woman's eyes were bright. "He will need both names to walk his path." Margot felt tears well up. "It's perfect, thank you." Taya began to sing, then, a soft Ute lullaby that made the baby's eyes grow heavy. The melody rose and fell like wind through pine branches. After a moment, Margot joined in with an English hymn, their voices weaving together in harmony. Jameson listened as he worked, his rough hands gentle on the cradle's wood. He'd built it years ago, before Sarah died, but it had stood empty too long. Now he carefully tightened loose joints and smoothed rough spots, making it ready for its new occupant. The morning passed peacefully. Taya showed Margot how to wrap Daniel in the Ute way, snug against her body, while she worked. Together they prepared herbs for healing tea, Taya teaching Margot the names and uses of each plant. When the cradle was ready, Jameson carried it to the warmest spot near the hearth. He'd lined it with soft deerskin and added a small pillow stuffed with clean straw. With infinite care, he laid Daniel inside. The baby made a small sound of contentment, his tiny fingers curling around the edge of his blanket. Jameson stood looking down at him for a long moment, his weathered face softening. "I need more firewood," he said gruffly, but Margot saw the smile tugging at his mouth as he headed outside. Through the window she watched him at the chopping block. His powerful swings were precise and steady, each log splitting cleanly. But what caught her attention was his expression. The years of grief seemed to have lifted, replaced by something lighter, almost peaceful. "He smiles more now," Taya observed, following Margot's gaze. "The cabin has been too quiet since my niece died. It does my heart good to hear a baby's laugh here again." Margot touched the older woman's arm. "I'm grateful for your blessing. I know I'm not—" She hesitated. "I'm not Sarah." "No," Taya agreed. "You are Margot, and you bring your own gifts, your own light." She patted Margot's hand. "Sarah would be pleased to see joy return to this place." As evening approached, Taya prepared to leave, promising to return in a few days. Jameson helped her mount her horse, then came back inside where Margot was cooking supper. The cabin felt different now, warmer, more alive. The smell of baking cornbread mingled with wood smoke and pine. Daniel slept peacefully in his cradle, one tiny hand flung above his head. They sat down to eat, the late sun painting the walls gold. Steam rose from their bowls of rabbit stew as they talked quietly about the future. Spring will come soon, Jameson said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. The passes will open. Trading will begin again. Margot's heart fluttered with sudden anxiety. What then? He met her eyes steadily. That depends on what you want. You and Daniel, you're welcome to stay. If you wish it. I do wish it, she whispered, more than anything. His large hand covered hers on the table. Then it settled. Margot looked around the cabin, at Daniel sleeping sweetly, at the herbs drying from the rafters, at the man across from her whose gruff kindness had saved her life in more ways than one. 5 days ago, I had nothing, she said softly. I was cast out, alone, ready to die in the snow. Now, she gestured at their shared table, their shared home. Now I have everything. Jameson's eyes crinkled at the corners, his smile deepening. The peace between them felt complete, as natural as breathing. Then they heard it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats coming up the valley. Jameson was on his feet in an instant, his smile vanishing as he reached for his rifle above the door. Margot hurried to the cradle, gathering Daniel protectively in her arms. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the snow-covered slopes. Through the window, the setting sun painted the white landscape blood red. Jameson checked his rifle with quick, practiced movements. His voice was tight when he spoke. Stay inside. No matter what happens, stay with the baby. Margot clutched Daniel closer, her heart pounding. Just moments ago, their world had felt so secure. Now danger approached with every hoofbeat, threatening to shatter their newfound peace. The sound grew closer, closer. Jameson positioned himself by the window, his rifle ready. The last rays of sunlight gleamed on the barrel as they waited to see who was coming up the trail. Margot began to pray silently, her lips moving against Daniel's dark hair. The baby slept, unaware of the tension filling the cabin. Outside, the hoofbeats thundered nearer, carrying with them the weight of the world they'd tried to leave behind. The hoofbeats grew closer, thundering against the frozen ground. Through the cabin's frosted window, Jameson made out 5 riders emerging from the deepening dusk. His jaw tightened as he recognized the lead figure's stiff-backed posture. Preacher Cullen. It's him, he said quietly to Margot, who stood clutching Daniel protectively to her chest. The baby slept peacefully, unaware of the approaching storm. Beside the preacher rode Sheriff March, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. 2 armed men flanked them, rifles across their saddles. Taya brought up the rear, having intercepted them on the trail. Her face was grim as she dismounted. Jameson lowered his rifle slowly. Violence would only make things worse. He had learned that lesson the hard way, years ago. Stay inside, he told Margot. Let me handle this. Jameson. Her voice trembled. Trust me. He squeezed her shoulder gently, then stepped out onto the porch. The winter air bit sharp and cold. Fresh snow crunched under the horses' hooves as the riders drew up before the cabin. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Steam rose from the horses' flanks in the gathering dark. Preacher Cullen broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. We've come for my wife and the child she's stolen. She came here seeking shelter, Jameson replied evenly. Both she and the baby were near death. That's as may be, Sheriff March cut in, but she's still a married woman. The law's clear on this matter. The preacher's lips curled in a sneer. Did you think you could hide her away up here, trapper? Like you hid with your heathen woman? Jameson's hands tightened on his rifle, but he kept his voice steady. I gave sanctuary to those in need, nothing more. Sanctuary? Cullen barked a harsh laugh. You've kidnapped my wife and harbored her in sin. Step aside. No. Jameson planted his feet firmly. She's not property to be claimed. She's a free woman who chose to leave. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Margot stepped out. Daniel bundled against her chest. "I left because you cast me out," she said, her voice stronger than Jameson expected. "You stood before God and the congregation and called me cursed." "Silence!" Cullen's face flushed dark with anger. "Sheriff, do your duty." Sheriff March dismounted with a weary sigh. His spurs jingled as he approached the porch. "Ma'am, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. You need to return to town with us." "I won't go back to him," Margot said. "I can't." "The law's the law, ma'am." The sheriff reached for her arm. "Don't force me to—" "The law?" Taya's voice rang out sharp as a hawk's cry. She strode forward, her silver hair gleaming in the dusk. "What of the law that says a man shall not abuse his wife? What of the Creator's law that commands mercy to the weak?" Cullen wheeled his horse toward her. "Keep quiet, old woman. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all who witness injustice," Taya shot back. "I have seen how you treat those in your care. The Creator sees too." The preacher's face twisted, his gaze fixed on the baby in Margot's arms. "What's this? The half-breed child?" He swung down from his horse. "So you've taken in the abomination as well." "He's not an abomination," Margot cried, backing away. "He's an innocent child." But Cullen was already mounting the porch steps. Jameson moved to block him, but the two armed men had their rifles trained on him now. "Don't make us shoot you, trapper," one called out. "Just let the preacher take what's his." Cullen shoved past Jameson and grabbed for the baby. Margot tried to turn away, but the sheriff still held her arm. With a triumphant snarl, Cullen wrenched Daniel from her grasp. The baby woke with a startled wail. The sound cut through the gathering darkness like a knife. "No!" Margot struggled against the sheriff's hold. "Please, don't take him!" Taya began to chant in Ute, her voice rising fierce and clear. Though few present understood the words, the power of her curse was unmistakable. She raised her arms to the darkening sky. "Let the Creator witness this injustice," she cried in English. "Let the spirits of earth and sky see how you treat the innocent. May your dreams be haunted until you make this right." "Silence your pagan witch," Cullen spat at Jameson. He held the crying baby awkwardly, like a sack of grain. "Or I'll have her arrested for threatening a man of God." Jameson's hands clenched into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to protect his newfound family. But violence would only bring more violence. He had to think of Margot and Daniel's safety. "I'll come for them," he said, his voice low and intense. "When the pass is clear, I'll come to town peacefully. We'll settle this before judge and jury if we must." "You'll stay away if you know what's good for you," Cullen sneered. He handed Daniel to one of his men, then grabbed Margot's other arm. "Come, wife. Time to remember your proper place." Margot looked back at Jameson as they dragged her toward the horses, her eyes wide with fear and grief. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "This isn't over," Jameson called to her. "I promise you that." They mounted up quickly, Margot and Daniel placed on the sheriff's horse. The baby's cries grew fainter as the group turned back toward the trail, merging with the gathering shadows. Taya spoke one final curse in Ute, her voice carrying on the wind. Then silence fell, broken only by the diminishing sound of hoofbeats. Jameson stood in the trampled snow, his fists clenched so tight his nails cut into his palms. Drops of blood stained the white ground at his feet. Every fiber of his being yearned to grab his rifle and pursue them, but he knew that would only end in bloodshed. He had to be smarter than that. Had to be better. For their sakes. Taya placed a weathered hand on his arm. "You did right," she said softly. "Fighting would have brought only death." "They took them." His voice was raw with anguish. "I just stood here and let them take them." "Sometimes the hardest strength is holding back," she replied. "You will find another way. A better way. Jameson looked down at his bleeding hands, then up at the darkened trail where his family had vanished. The cabin behind him felt suddenly empty, haunted by echoes of Daniel's cries and Margot's gentle voice. "I'll get them back," he vowed. "Whatever it takes, I'll find a way to bring them home." The wind picked up, carrying the first flakes of new snow. Taya murmured a prayer to the Creator as darkness settled over the mountain. In the distance, a lone wolf howled, a sound of loss that seemed to echo the pain in Jameson's heart. He knelt in the bloody snow, his shoulders bowed but unbroken. The night grew deeper around him, but he remained there, wrestling with his rage and grief, fighting to find a path through this darkness that wouldn't end in more violence. Behind him, the cabin's warm light spilled out onto the snow, a beacon of the home that had been torn apart. But not forever. Not if he had anything to say about it. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber and rose as Jameson methodically prepared for the journey ahead. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking each strap of the saddle, testing the cinch. The leather creaked in the crisp morning air. He packed light but smart, strips of dried venison wrapped in cloth, a water skin, and a small pouch of coffee. His rifle would stay home. He wouldn't give anyone cause to claim he came looking for trouble. Taya emerged from the shadows of the pines, her silver hair catching the first light. She carried a small bundle of herbs tied with sinew. "The town has changed since you last rode in," she warned, pressing the bundle into his hand. "Cullen has poisoned many minds against you. They whisper that you bewitched his wife, that you steal children for the Ute." Jameson secured the herbs in his saddlebag. "Let them whisper. I aim to speak only truth." "Truth may not be enough." Taya's dark eyes held his. "The preacher has built his power on fear and shame. Such men do not yield easily to truth." "Then I'll speak louder," Jameson replied, swinging up into the saddle. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing his tension. "Not with fists or bullets, but with words that can't be denied." Taya nodded slowly. "May the Creator guide your path." She touched her hand to her heart, then extended it toward him, a gesture of blessing. "Remember, sometimes the quietest voice carries furthest." Miles away, on the rough wagon road leading to town, Margot huddled in the back of Sheriff March's wagon. The early morning cold bit through her shawl, but she focused on keeping Daniel warm, tucking the blanket tighter around his small form. The baby slept fitfully, whimpering whenever the wagon jolted over a rut. Each tiny sound pierced Margot's heart. She hummed softly, trying to soothe him and herself. Preacher Cullen rode alongside, his horse's hooves kicking up dust. His shadow fell across them whenever the sun broke through the trees. "Your sin will be cleansed," he called out, satisfaction heavy in his voice, a public confession before the congregation. "Then perhaps God will see fit to restore you." Margot held Daniel closer, saying nothing. The sheriff glanced back at her, something like sympathy in his weathered face, but he quickly looked away. "The mountain man has corrupted you," Cullen continued, "filled your head with savage ways, but we'll burn that corruption out." He smiled thinly. "As for the half-breed child?" "His name is Daniel," Margot said quietly, but firmly. "The child," Cullen went on as if she hadn't spoken, "will be sent where he belongs, among his mother's people, far from Christian folk." Margot's arms tightened around Daniel. She thought of Jameson's gentle hands repairing the cradle, of Taya's healing songs, of the pure joy in that small cabin. How could such love be wrong? The wagon train wound slowly down through the foothills as the sun climbed higher. Cullen led the way, the two armed men flanking the wagon. Sheriff March handled the reins with careful attention, avoiding the worst of the bumps. Meanwhile, Jameson followed a different path, one that would bring him to town from the north. His horse picked its way sure-footed along game trails and abandoned mining tracks. He kept his mind focused on the task ahead, refusing to let anger cloud his thoughts. The morning wore on. Shadows shortened as the sun rose higher, but a chill remained in the air. Jameson passed familiar landmarks: a lightning-struck pine, a tumbled mass of red rocks, an old prospect hole half hidden by scrub oak. Each mile brought him closer to confrontation. He touched the small Bible in his coat pocket. Margot's Bible, left behind in the chaos. Its presence reminded him of quiet evenings reading together, of the gentle strength in her voice as she shared her faith. That was the truth he would speak, not just his own, but the truth of a family forged in mercy and love. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, both parties drew closer to their destination. The wagon train descended into the valley, where the town sprawled along the river. Margot could see smoke rising from chimneys, hear the distant ring of the smithy's hammer. Jameson crested a ridge and saw the same sight from the opposite direction. He paused for a moment, letting his horse rest. Below him lay the town that had rejected him, that had scorned his marriage and mocked his grief. Now it held his future within its wooden walls and muddy streets. "Lord," he whispered, "give me wisdom to speak and strength to stand." The sun hung low in the western sky as travelers from mountain and valley converged on their separate paths toward a single destination. Between them lay a town, a congregation, and a reckoning that would test the limits of faith, love, and forgiveness. Sunday morning arrived under slate-gray skies that matched the somber mood in town. Wooden wagon wheels creaked through muddy streets as families made their way to church, drawn by word that Preacher Cullen would address the scandal that had set tongues wagging all week. Inside the whitewashed church, rough-hewn pews groaned under the weight of the gathered congregation. Oil lamps cast wavering shadows on concerned faces. Women clutched their prayer books, while men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes. Preacher Cullen stood at the pulpit, his face hard as granite. Margot sat in the front pew, Daniel bundled tightly in her arms. Two deputies flanked Jameson near the back door, their hands resting meaningfully on their gun belts. "Behold!" Cullen's voice cracked like summer lightning. "How sin creeps among us like a serpent!" His fist struck the pulpit. "This woman, this adulteress, has betrayed not only her sacred vows but embraced heathen ways, and this child—" He jabbed a finger toward Daniel. "This abomination born of two worlds—" Margot rose slowly to her feet, her face pale but composed. "If mercy's a sin," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed church, "then may God judge me kindly." She turned to face the congregation, holding Daniel close. "I found this baby abandoned, sick and starving. My husband burned his cradle and cast him out." Her voice grew stronger. "When I was thrown into the snow to die, Jameson Boone showed Christian charity. He gave me shelter, respect, and helped save this child's life through a fever that should have killed him." Murmurs rippled through the pews. Several women dabbed at their eyes. Old Sarah Miller, who had lost 3 babies of her own, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. "He lies!" Cullen's face twisted with rage. He lunged forward, his open hand striking Margot across the face. The sharp crack of the blow echoed through the church. Daniel woke with a piercing wail that shattered the stunned silence. Margot staggered but kept her feet, one hand protectively cradling the crying baby's head. The congregation sat frozen, caught between years of fearful obedience and the undeniable truth before them. A woman standing tall despite her bruised cheek, a child's innocent tears, and a preacher's mask of righteousness finally cracked to reveal the darkness beneath. A hush fell over the church as boot steps echoed from the doorway. Taya stood there, wrapped in a blanket the color of mountain bluebells, her silver hair catching the lamplight. She moved down the center aisle with quiet dignity, each step deliberate on the wooden floors. "I remember you, Nathaniel Cullen," she said, her voice clear and strong. "10 winters ago, you lay dying of fever on the missionary road." Her dark eyes held the preacher's. "My people found you. I tended you for 7 days with medicine and prayer." Color drained from Cullen's face as recognition dawned. He gripped the pulpit's edge, knuckles white. "You promised before the Creator to show kindness to all his children." Taya's words fell like stones in still water. "Yet when my niece, Jameson's beloved wife, died in childbirth, you refused her Christian burial. You said her Indian blood made her unworthy of your graveyard." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Miller crossed herself, whispering a prayer. The sheriff's deputy removed his hat, head bowed in shame. "You judge this woman and child?" Taya gestured to Margot and Daniel. "Look first to your own heart's darkness." Cullen swayed, his face ashen. The proud mask crumbled, revealing the frightened man beneath. Without a word, he stumbled from the pulpit and fled through the side door, his footsteps fading into the muddy street. Sheriff March stepped forward, unpinning his badge. "Reckon true justice is spoken here today," he said gruffly. "Some laws ain't written in books." He nodded to his deputies, who released their hold on Jameson. Jameson crossed the church in long strides, taking Margot's trembling hand in his calloused one. Daniel cooed softly between them, reaching for Jameson's beard. Taya raised her arms, first speaking in Ute, words of blessing that seemed to fill the church with warmth. Then in English, "What Creator has joined through mercy, let no man tear asunder." The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, sending rays of light through the church's windows. They fell across Margot and Jameson, Daniel cradled between them, as if heaven itself smiled upon their union. 5 days after the church confrontation, the valley rang with hammer strikes and sawing. Townsfolk gathered by Willow Creek, working side by side to raise a simple chapel beneath the pines. The old bronze bell, rescued from the church steeple, found a new home in a rough-hewn tower of fresh-cut timber. Margot watched from the creek bank, Daniel sleeping against her shoulder, as Jameson and 3 miners mounted the bell. Its deep tone echoed off the canyon walls when they tested it, startling a flock of mountain bluebirds into flight. "Sound carries far up here," Jameson said, climbing down. "Might bring folks together from both sides of the valley now." By midday, the chapel stood complete, open to the sky except for its slanted roof. Wooden benches faced a simple altar made from a split log. Taya had woven fresh pine boughs into garlands that perfumed the air. As the sun reached its peak, families began arriving. Miners in clean shirts walked beside settlers in their Sunday best. From the western ridge came Ute families in bright blankets, children running ahead to splash in the creek. Before the altar, Jameson and Margot stood with Daniel, who wore a soft deerskin gown Taya had made. The old healer raised her hands, speaking first in Ute, then English. "This child bridges 2 worlds. May he grow strong in both." One by one, the preacher's former followers stepped forward. Mrs. Miller wiped tears as she asked forgiveness for her silence during Margot's shaming. The sheriff's wife embraced both families, promising to help care for Daniel. Even gruff Mr. Peterson, who once spurned Jameson's trade, offered his weathered hand in peace. Margot's voice trembled as she addressed them all. "Faith dies in judgment but grows in kindness. Each of you has helped plant new seeds of hope." As evening painted the cliffs gold, the community gathered around cooking fires. The aroma of venison stew and fresh bread filled the air. Settler children tried Ute songs, while their new friends taught them to string pine nut necklaces. Jameson watched it all from a log bench, one arm around Margot, the other cradling sleeping Daniel. Above them, the first stars brightened against the deepening blue. Hymns rose from beside the fires, Amazing Grace in English, and Ute voices blending as one, carried up the valley by the evening wind. The mountain air held the crisp sweetness of early spring as Margot stepped onto the front porch of their rebuilt cabin. Dawn painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and gold, while the valley below stirred with new life. Baby Daniel cooed in her arms, his tiny fingers reaching for the sunbeams that danced through the pine branches. The cabin itself stood transformed. Fresh-cut logs had replaced the weathered walls, and a new roof gleamed with cedar shakes. Bright curtains, sewn from traded cloth, framed windows that sparkled in the morning light. By the door, early wildflowers pushed through the melting snow, purple lupine and yellow glacier lilies that Taya had planted as a blessing. Jameson emerged from the cabin, his usual quiet manner softened by tenderness. In his weathered hand, he held something small that caught the sunrise's glow, a simple silver ring, worn smooth by years of love. Margot recognized it instantly as the one that had belonged to his first wife. "She'd want you to have it," Jameson said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've brought life back to these mountains, same as she did." He took Margot's free hand, his calloused fingers gentle as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "I promise you this. Shame won't ever touch you again. Not while I draw breath." Tears welled in Margot's eyes as she looked at the ring, then at the man before her. Daniel giggled, reaching for Jameson's beard, and the mountain man's face creased in a smile as he lifted the boy high. "We'll teach him everything," Margot said softly. "The Psalms and the parables, the stories of David and Daniel." She touched the deerskin pouch that hung around the baby's neck, Taya's gift filled with sacred herbs. "And the Ute weighs too, so he'll know all of who he is." "Reckon that's how it should be," Jameson agreed. "Two paths making one trail, like streams joining in the valley." From below, the chapel bell began to toll, its clear notes floating up through the morning mist. The sound marked more than time. It rang out hope, reconciliation, the binding of old wounds into new strength. Other bells joined in, echoing from scattered homesteads where neighbors had hung their own chimes in answer. Margot gazed across the valley, remembering that bitter night months ago when she'd collapsed in the snow, praying for death. Now spring sunlight warmed her face, and love filled her arms. Her voice carried quiet wonder as she spoke. "They called me Barren once, but faith, like this mountain, gives life where hearts have thawed." Daniel's laughter bubbled up again as a pine jay swooped past, its blue wings flashing. Jameson gathered them both close, and together they started down the path that led to the valley. Around them, the land itself seemed to celebrate renewal. Fresh grass sparkled with dew. Columbines nodded in the breeze. A mule deer and her fawn grazed peacefully near the trail, unafraid. Their laughter mingled with the morning sounds, the creek's song, the wind's whisper through flowering pines, the distant bells still ringing welcome. Each step carried them forward into the promise of their shared life, where love had built bridges stronger than prejudice, and mercy had transformed winter into spring. The mountain kept its ancient watch above them, unchanged yet witnessing change, just as it had seen hatred yield to healing and loneliness bloom into family beneath its steadfast gaze. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.